Welcome everybody to the Transfer and Articulation Community Practice Forum. I will give you just a minute or two to go ahead and settle in, and please try to turn your mics off if possible, and we will get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give it about 30 more seconds before I kick everything into high gear for people to join. Zoom has a little bit of delay when people are joining, so I'm just going to give it a few more seconds before I get into everything proper. I hope you're having a wonderful Friday. If you are on the East Coast, ready to get off work. If you're on the West Coast like me, still in the thick of things, but at least we're closer to Saturday than not. All right, I think things have slowed down from attendees, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Booker. I am the chair of the Transfer and Articulation Committee for AACRAO, and today joining me is Wendy Davis to talk a little bit about supporting adult students in transfer. Today, Nathan Pesavento from WGU was supposed to join us as my co-host as well. Unfortunately, he had some other conflicts today and was not able to join at the last minute. But I think with Wendy and myself, you're in very good hands based off of our experience with students and in the world of adult learners. To give you a little bit of background, I work at the University of Phoenix. I was before becoming our vice provost, the vice president of admissions and evaluation. I did that for about 8 years. So I've seen a lot of students in the working adult fields come through. And then Wendy is the transfer center director for the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, a large institution, University of Tennessee area. And so she's had a lot of experience with transfer and dealing with students of different ages and types. So I think you're in, again, great hands as we go through this. So what we're going to start with is I'm going to go through a little bit of information about some challenges adult students face in the transfer world. During the session at any time, feel free to put a question in the chat. And then at the end of the session, we'll also have time for an open Q&A for any questions that you have about adult transfer students or challenges you're facing. As we get to the end of the session too, if there's a question that some other people on the call want to chime in with, they can feel free to do so as well. So, but before we get into it, I do want to talk about what these transfer and articulation community of practice calls are. They are a every other month call that is put on by the AACRAO Transfer and Articulation Committee as part of our work as a committee. We felt that it would be important to have open calls where people can just talk shop about transfer, especially given the greater importance it's had since in the last 10 years, but even COVID expedited that quite a bit. This is just a shared space for the community to kind of talk about different scenarios and to create connections with people on the call in case you want to create phone a friends or other people that may know information about the scenarios we're talking about or in your location or region. One of the things that I will also say about these calls, they are recorded. So if you like what you see and you want to share it with the individuals on your teams, feel free to do so. It'll be saved on the AACRAO website as a recording. And also the topics we go through is sourced from the attendees on this call. The topic of adult transfer was something that this group had brought up as something they wanted to talk about. So with that, we'll get started. But if you have ideas for other calls, we do these every other month, feel free to reach out. So our agenda today is kind of starting with supporting adult students and some guiding principles. As someone who comes from an institution that has supported adult learners for a long time, I want to talk about kind of the paradigms you should look at. They are different than your traditional 18 to 24-year age students. They also have different needs, requirements, and they approach education and the process of going back to school differently. Within that also, because they are adult learners, that means that they are older and they oftentimes provide some different complexities or quirks in the transfer process. We'll talk about some of those. And I was, based off of one of the requests that came through in one of our prior calls, going to go over some documentation issues that adult learners face. As I go through each section, I'm also going to give time to Wendy to chime in on any of her thoughts of these these items, and then she's also free to take any of the questions as well. So getting into it, when you look at adult students, it's really important that we support them because, and this statistic keeps going up. So every time I have to do a slide about this, the first time I did it, I think it was 28 million, and now it's between 35 to 40 million. Every time someone does a new study, whether it's the clearinghouse or whatnot, the number goes up. But it says, we have that many million students in the United States, 35 to 40 million, that have earned some credit but have not obtained a degree. And with a large portion of these students being over the age of 25. Lumina, National Student Clearinghouse, a lot of people have done studies, and the number is just huge. So, and that's also a huge market to help students actually obtain their academic outcomes and goals. So that's why it's important. But it's also important, again, and I mentioned this a little bit, and we'll dive into it deeper, adult learners' needs and expectations differ greatly from someone who's 18 to 24-year-old. They require a different approach from our admissions and registrar's offices, which is really great that we have this forum to talk to all of you in AACRAO and at large about this topic. And also the other thing that you have to know, and we'll go into it, some common concepts we hold, or I'll call them rules or laws that we generally have in our transfer offices, don't always hold true with adult students, especially depending on their age. And we'll go into that a little bit about some documentation things, because a lot of times, especially whether you're the admissions office, registrar's office, transfer center, whoever has the locus of control for transfer on your campus, they can kind of break your system pretty good, depending on their scenario and depending on what their past experiences are. So we'll dive into all of that, but that's why it's supporting them and finding out how to support them is important, because there's a lot of individuals out there, and a lot of them are looking to come back to school, whether it is an adult serving school like mine or a more traditional school like Wendy's. They are looking to come back, and we have to find those ways to help them and support them. So the first adult student guiding principle that I really want to touch on is when you're looking at an adult learner, what I like to call it is using the whole person paradigm when working with the adult student. It is looking at everything they bring to the table, whether it's diverse experiences, which could turn into CPL or PLA, or their work experience at just from being in a certain discipline or organization or prior understanding. They bring different things to the classroom as far as understanding and experience, sometimes in a subject matter. So when you look at an adult student, you have to look at it from every facet that they're bringing to the table, which also comes into the issue that adult students are also not a monolith, but they share a couple of traits that are pretty consistent. And one is they have limited time because of numerous obligations. As we have all gone through our lives, as you become an adult, you find that you're having children, taking care of parents, all kinds of different things that can happen where you have limited time because of everything else going on in your life. And so when you're working with an adult transfer student, things that you can do to help them in the process or remove friction from the process is essential and useful, which a lot of times, and it's true, some younger students may be more apt to do a lot of the heavy lifting and heavy work. When you become an adult, you become a little bit more used to consumerism, I'll call it, and you want things done for you a little bit or explained to you in different ways. And so you have to understand that, and they'll bring that different to the table. And it's kind of like looking in the mirror on what do we want when we are getting a service provided. What would our adult students want? And it would be different than what we may have desired in our younger years. The other thing that's really important, adult learners don't like to repeat content. If in their minds that they have done something before, whether it's learning, accounting, taking English composition classes, years ago, they don't prefer to repeat content. Now, I give this in a caveat, and I want to make sure, no matter whether it's an adult student or a younger age student, we should always ensure our academic integrity as institutions. So just because a student wants something doesn't mean we do it, or if they repeated content or they think they repeated content, but the content has changed in technology or nursing or some very specific disciplines, does not mean that you don't make them do it. You just have to also be able to explain why they may have to, in their mind, repeat something they already did. But if also you get to a point where a student wants to transfer something and it's kind of like on the fence of, well, they're pretty close to understanding those things and the core competencies of the course they're transferring in to satisfy your institution, it is generally better to veer on the side of what I like to call compliant empathy, which is giving the transfer credit award and then evaluating how students do. Because oftentimes your adult students, the more credits they earn, and this is a statistical thing that you can find in most studies, the more credits a student brings into an institution, the better they retain. I have not yet seen, and I'm sure someone could find one on this call maybe, but in the general literature that exists in academia on transfer, the more students transfer, the better they retain. And so if you can go on that compliant empathy side, I would suggest you do so, especially if you're an institution where your leadership is looking to get into that adult student learning sector and market. And again, look at the student as for everything they bring to the table, not only from a learning perspective, but also from prior experience and from even knowledge on how they can be a viable part of the populace on your campus. And so some strategy to support this whole person paradigm are asking for information beyond the standard application. A lot of standard admissions applications won't ask, what's your prior work experience or what have you done in your past or other things like that. Some do now, but some don't unless it's a specific admissions requirement. But again, if you're getting in that area, understanding that adult learner and who they are helps them feel a connection to your institution, and that also helps them retain. The other thing that's really important if you are going to be in this area and your institution is open to it is to create robust transfer credit and credit for prior learning options. It's essential that if you are supporting adult learners, if they have, whether it's tests they don't remember taking in the past, AP exams from 20 years ago when it's an adult learner, or CLEP or DSST exams they may have taken, or a military student, if you have those CPL operations that can give prior learning credit, those can really, really help the student feel a connection to your institution. And CALE has done numerous studies, excuse me, on this, that students who transfer in any amount of CPL generally stick to the institution better because they feel a connection to not only their learning, but their life experience to the institution. And we can take some time to talk about the different types of CPL and life experiential learning, which is also a subset of CPL, which is kind of the one that gets most cloudy for institutions or what they should or shouldn't do. But if you have that and can do that, I highly recommend it. And then I talked a little bit already about their past experiences. And then this is something that a lot of schools that are in this space have thought about is rethinking academic program design or degree builds. Creating degree builds that are more transfer friendly, where you're not sacrificing the major or the core of study or required course sequence, depending on what your institution calls it, and you're not sacrificing the degree outcomes, but also looking at what's the gen ed requirements, what creates the balanced outcomes for the students, and what are ways that we can adjust that degree program to transfer in more things. And for example, some institutions they'll look at their major courses, and they'll also look at if someone brings in XYZ experience in a business profession, some of the lower division foundational courses may be satisfied with that, and the degree build changes slightly. So those are some ways to look at it, and it's a special transfer degree that they create specifically for adult learners that have some different outcomes. So I'm going to stop there on talking about these guiding principles in the whole person paradigm so that Wendy can chime in on what she sees at her institution before we move on.
Thank you. Well, so what we're doing, especially here at university at UT, we are, public land grant institution, but also recognizing that things need to change. Once upon a time, we had a more robust setup for adult learners. We actually had, people who are hired. We had the evening classes, weekend classes, things like that. And now we're doing the work to get back to something like that. We're also recognizing the need for online, like Mark was saying. Time limitations, family limitations, job, things like that, being able to provide more online learning is becoming critical, especially so the state of Tennessee has the Drive to 55, which is a goal 55% of Tennesseans who are equipped with a college degree or certificate. We have a Tennessee Reconnect program, which is designed for adult learners who want to go back to the community colleges, which means here at UT, we have to build more programming for those students once they're completing an associate's degree. Similar to especially the transfer credit and the CPL operations for in-state. If a student completes an associate's degree from any of our Tennessee community colleges, then their gen eds are done, are complete, and then they can simply focus on what they need to do to complete their degree. And I have the pleasure of being in the transfer center because we can focus completely on transfer students. We can get to know more of our students. And that has included sitting down and walking through every aspect of the application, depending on the age of the learner who wants to complete an application. And so we have the more robust conversations and being able to evaluate credit, prior learning credit, whether it's more of the adult certificate kind, not so much the, AP, IB, CLAP. We know all that, but looking at other more professionally focused certifications and things like that, to use some of those to apply more prior learning credit. So that's where we are. We're adding more degree completion programs right now, again, to address our adult learners. I'm one of those adult learners who wanted to take additional classes because they're free, but I need something after hours. I don't want to do it at 2:00 in the afternoon and those kinds of things. So that's where we're seeing the need. And then we have created an entire department, which is our online learning and academic programs, to build more programs and make general education courses more available for students who want to come to UT.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Wendy, and appreciate that. And definitely can hear a lot of the same things I kind of mentioned on looking at students in different ways and different capacities for what they bring to the table. So that's great information. So supporting adult students represents some unique challenges, and a few of these I'm going to dive into from a documentation perspective. And it's a lot of times based off of the time, prior schools attended, academic experience. A lot of things can be challenging for the student because they don't fit the decades of policies or things that we've created for what we considered our traditional age students. Now, things are obviously changing, and in the 22 years I've been in higher education, the world looks completely different. And that is a short amount of time overall when you look at higher ed in the United States, but the amount of change that we've consumed in that amount of time has been monumental. I can say for a fact, 22 years ago when I started, the idea of PLA and CPL was kind of a little bit like sorcery. And now most schools have some sort of normal process or they're open to it, but it was not that way 22 years ago. So some things adult learners face, though, are documentation issues, and I do want to take a deep dive on that based on requests that happen. And we'll talk about the type of documentation issues that adult learners face. Credit recency issues. Credit recency issues are, how old was the credit and can you transfer it into the institution? A lot of institutions have policies on how old a credit can be before they can accept it. And they have challenges that, obviously, if you're an adult student or adult learner, chances are you attended college at one point your prior experience, and now you're coming back, and could be 10, 15, 20. I've evaluated transcripts that are 40 years old in certain cases, and that's a treat, by the way. It's not the same way as it is today. There's also gaps in records. When a student went to multiple institutions or things like that, they're going to create gaps in records. And then I talked a little bit about policy conflicts because of just the type of paradigms and the type of degree programs we've created historically, and what the different factors an adult learner can bring to the table that may kind of break those policies or long-held traditions. So to start with documentation issues, and this is different, and I know we have about 30-oddish, 20-oddish, 25-oddish participants, but depending on the state you're in and depending on your institutional policies, secondary completion verification or documentation, which is high school, we'll call it secondary completion for the broad table of it. Some institutions allow for self-certification, which means not seeing any documentation, and other schools want the exact documentation, whether it's a diploma or a transcript of the secondary completion. It is all over the map. So for some schools, this is not as pertinent. In other schools, this is completely pertinent and can be a hassle. And the reason being is records in higher ed, luckily, have been kept a lot better than records at secondary completion schools, i.e. high schools. It is not good when you have to get high school completion documents 20, 30, 40 years ago. It just is a pain, especially if you're an institution that needs to verify or validate these type of things. In a lot of cases, those original documentation is not out there. So and a lot of schools have had to change this over time of saying, I want to see your high school transcript from the high school. If it's closed, if the custodian is not doing their job, all those type of things can happen. So you have to look at ways that you can make a viable exception, especially if you're verifying that. So a couple of ways to do this if you can't get a diploma or you can't get a transcript from high school. And also I'm aware that a diploma is in the student's possession. So there's always a risk of fraud, but we're not going to delve too far into that at this point. But if you're needing verification documentation, and let's say you need a transcript or something more than that, if the student attended a prior college, so if, again, college record keeping is generally good. So let's say the student can't come up with their high school documents, but they attended a college 15 to 20 years ago through, depending on your documentation needs, a FERPA request, or FERPA can be generally waived for this, but it depends on your interpretation. Ask them to see if they have the original high school documents that they would have ordered 15 to 20 years ago. If they do have that, you'd be surprised at how many keep them and they're there. Then you can use that to satisfy your own needs. It's kind of like a chain of provenance, if you will, as far as the high school completion documentation. And that's one of the easiest ways. If the student went to a college earlier on, that college is likely to have some sort of proof of that because they were having to verify it 15, 20, 30 years ago. So that's an easy way to do that. It's an acceptable practice. Some people don't know it. You just have to get a letter from that college, or if they give you a photocopy or whatever it is, you can put that in your notes and that should work because they did the work for you before. And as an accredited institution and partner in that can help. Also, you can, if this individual was employed, certain employment files, and I bring this up, the military back in the day, they would actually get secondary completion documents. So when the students coming in, especially if they were at the time where the only thing you can get is a DD 214, and for those who evaluated military, they know what I'm talking about for a long time. The military sometimes did get secondary completion documents, or employment files may have them because, again, that was something that may have been part and parcel of asking for back in the day. And then the other thing is, especially if you're in a statewide system. So let's assume, and I'll just use my system in Arizona for an example. Let's assume 20 years ago, a student went to U of A and they are now going to ASU, and you're in the same system, and you know what U of A's policies are because you're under the same boards of regents and all those other things, and they accepted it to post-secondary study, and they have the information and knowledge and record keeping of that, but not the documentation. You sometimes can review that and waive secondary completion requirement, saying because this other school in our system did this, we believe the student had secondary completion, and we're moving that forward, even though we can't obtain documentation from the high school. Some state policies say, actually, if you really dig deep in the regulations, say you can do that. Other state policies are less so. I don't know all 50 of them offhand, but it exists out there, and that's a way to do it. And again, this is a documentation issue for the secondary documents, which is the most cloudy in some cases because high schools are under different demands state by state. And so first, I'll see, Wendy, if you have anything else you want to chime in on that topic. And then we'll go ahead in case there's any other questions that someone wants to put in the chat.
A couple quick things. So one, again, what we do, 24 credits or college credits completed or more, we don't need anything from high school. So that can be beneficial, especially for some of our adult learners who have attended multiple institutions. Or on top of that, a time limit. If it's been, if the student is over 21 or it's been 3, 4, 5 or more years since high school graduation, then again, just not requiring that documentation as long as we have, especially some type of college course credit or military or something like that is also beneficial and is a relief for a lot of prospective students, adult learners.
Thanks, Wendy. That's a great point because there is a lot of rules, especially transferring an X amount of credits will waive that requirement. And there's also other different things that even in the Title IV regs, there are different ways to get around that, and or not get around is probably too severe of a term, but also satisfy the requirements of secondary completion out there. But what you're really looking for secondary completion, and this is something to keep in mind from an admissions perspective, even though we like to become document hawks in our roles as registrars and whatnot. It's just to make sure the student has the baseline skills and ability to be successful at your institution. So if they're bringing other things to the table and you can, that you know that they'll be successful and a good person on campus for your degree programs, that's the point of generally secondary verification, secondary completion. But again, it is an area that gets, depending on who you are, your school, your policies, this can be something with an adult learner that can be quite a hassle in certain cases. The other area that can become very difficult is closed post-secondary schools. So as post-secondary schools close, there is generally each state has a policy that if the school closes, they will assign a custodian to be over those records. And with adult learners, there's the chance that they may have attended a school that no longer is open and they have to do that. Now, the issue with adult learners in closed post-secondary schools is that our general transcript practice, which is universally recognized, is to get an official transcript from the institution. There may be zero chance with a closed school a student can get an official transcript from the institution because it's closed. And in those cases, you would want to seek the custodian for a record, but they may not generate a new transcript. They may have to generate a copy of the transcript with a letter or some sort of other document to accept. Those are okay to accept, and I've had different instances where institution peers have reached out and said, can I even accept this? Because it's not, quote unquote, an official transcript issued by the institution. The answer is yes, that's an acceptable practice. It is something official, at least issued by the custodian, and they're verifying it is accurate. The other thing to do, if the custodian, and this sometimes happens, does not have the ability to replicate the record, there are a couple other different things you can do. If a prior post-secondary school has that transcript and went through the process of officially verifying it, officially evaluating it, if they're willing to share a copy of that for you, with you, and also verify that they had it received as official, you can put notes on that as an exception that will satisfy the requirements for generally any body that's out there that this was an official transcript, even though it was not issued by the institution directly to you. It was issued directly to another institution. And as long as you trust them, that's fine. The edge case scenario that is the kind of the worst scenario is if no one can verify anything and the student has a transcript in their hand, that the custodian can say, we know we went here and this happens, because I've dealt with it and I know others have dealt with it. Student has gone to our school, we know they went there, I can't verify exactly what they did at the school, but I know they were on the record of enrollment and the student has the transcript in their possession. At that point, if you are willing to, what I would suggest, again, your choice as an institution, get as much syllabi, other documentation, other things like that, and put it through your credit for prior learning process. The student may not get a 1-for-1 credit that's on that document because you can't verify it, but you could also evaluate and say, okay, we think that this is what the best case is. We do know the student went there, but no one can verify that. And the only official document in the world, or a document they have, is in their possession. You can do some CPL stuff with that. That's fair, but I would go through that. I would evaluate it almost like a professional training portfolio, and you decide what you want to do with that on those ends. So those are some of the ways to handle closed post-secondary schools. And again, it happens more, well, when you're serving adult learners, it happens more often than you think that you're going to run into a scenario like this. But there are ways to verify, again, I'll call it the provenance or chain of custody for these documentation. And as long as you appropriately notate that, and someone else had it previously, and you aren't concerned about any fraud or things like that, again, that's where I would land on the side of what I call that compliant empathy. So Wendy, I'll see if you have any of your own experiences with this, or if anyone also wants to put any questions in the chat about this one.
Nothing to add, just what you just said, honestly.
Okay, very cool. So then moving on into our next area that I want to talk about is academic policies, and go through a couple of the academic policy items or issues that you can run into with adult students and things to consider, especially if your institution is looking to or trying to serve more adult learners. And so again, we went over this. Most institutions have policies that are tuned to the traditional age student, and they're not always reflective of some adult needs. And so you may want to take a look at what you're doing in that. The first one is really to look at the recency or currency of credits being transferred. And what has happened is a lot of schools used to have a monolithic, if the course is older than X, we're not accepting it. 10, 15, 20, 30, we can put whatever number it is. Each school was different with what they did. They would have a monolithic number of, if it's older than that, we're not accepting credit. Well, things have changed a bit, and a lot of institutions have taken a look at getting rid of a monolithic number and being nuanced with some of those numbers, especially where the courses may apply. For example, generally most degrees, and again, schools are different, but in higher ed in the United States, most degrees have three components: an elective component, which is kind of a free-for-all, a general education component, and your major/required course of study. What some schools have looked at is going, okay, for electives, because really what those are is a free-for-all in a sense, not selectives, but true electives. All we are looking for in those cases are courses that equal our semester or quarter or trimester value. And as long as the course equaled that value, the student had at one point in their life taken the level of learning that equates to that appropriate amount of hours at the post-secondary level. So they'll remove a recency or currency requirement for electives. They'll go, it really doesn't matter, because really the student, even 20 years ago, they did something on their own. It was at an academic level, and it meets the standard Carnegie hours to get semester, quarter, trimester, whatever have you at that end. Then they'll start to get more nuanced on general education and even more nuanced on their major. So they may go gen eds, probably 10 years or less, unless it's a special science or something like that. And then major course of study may be even lower, 5 to 3 years. Some people widen that net if they're serving adult students. Some people lower that net. But what I have seen is a lot of institutions looking at, can we be more nuanced on how we support students and really what our needs of our degree are? Because our needs of our degree is to give a student an education that is relevant to the outcomes of the field they're going into. And when you look at those three levels, or kind of three areas of a degree, if you give an open wide swath for elective credits, it's not going to minimize the academic learning the student's going to get from their major course of study and their gen eds if you create some tighter protocols. That's all up to the institution. Some institutions still have the monolithic number, and that's fine for them if that's the students they serve, but something to consider if you're getting the adult learner game, looking at kind of those recency or currency to ensure that the student's just getting value for the things that they've done. And if they are going to repeat content that hasn't changed, at that point, you don't want them to, because it increases debt, it increases a lot of other things that we don't want to have in higher education. The other area is academic policies on transfer credit limitations. Most schools are starting to go towards their overall transfer credit limit being whatever their accrediting body or institutional accrediting body asks for overall. And a lot of times at the undergraduate level, the transfer credit limitation for overall is you can generally transfer in 75% of a degree, and you have to complete the last 25% at the institution for true residency. Now, there are a lot of different nuances to that. Some institutional accrediting bodies are a little bit different. If you have program-added accreditation, they're a little bit different. But if you look at your limitations, and are they serving your institution and serving the students coming in, evaluating that, because some institutions, even though they could transfer more credits, decided, no, you have to take half the degree at our university. Whereas when you look at, and if you've heard the term 3+1 in articulation, that's generally why accrediting bodies say you can transfer in 75%. That's your 3+1. If you have and I'll talk semester credits, 120 credit semester degree, 90 can be transferred in, that's 75% of 120, et cetera, et cetera. But long and short, what I'm saying here is, if you have transfer credit limitations for whatever reason it is, look at them and make sure they're serving your institution and the modern student. And they may, and there may be very great reasons why you limit credits, because your degree is so specialized, so unique, and meets certain outcomes, that is what students are going to your institution for, by all means, keep the limitations in place. But just know when you release those limitations for adult students, again, that propensity to retain, become a graduate, and serve that 35 to 40 million population that doesn't have a degree increases. So something to ponder on your policies if you haven't taken a look. The other is CPL and non-traditional credit acceptance. So this goes with some things that Wendy has said and I have said through this. When you're looking at what you do with credit for prior learning is a space that is very helpful, because oftentimes adult learners have some sort of CPL in their background. And I will say this with this caveat, even if they don't remember. And that's because you sometimes have to ask them. You would be surprised at how many 40-year-olds that you ask, hey, did you take any tests in your past? No. What about an AP exam? Oh yeah, I did take an AP exam. Oh, well, let's get that for you. We can use it for something probably. Sometimes DSST exams, especially for students who were in the military a long time ago, they may not have remembered they took a DSST as part of their training. Some of those other things that are out there. And there's a lot of standardized things, whether it's ACE credit, national testing programs, like I mentioned, CLEP, DSST, IB, AP, all those things. Asking them about that is an easy way to get them involved. Also, if you can, and this is not for every school, if you have ability to assess prior learning portfolios where you're assessing the learning from a student's prior experience, and I stress the word learning from prior experience, not the experience itself, to grant credit, that is when you can grant credit for prior learning from experience, you pretty much keep those students. They don't go anywhere else because it's special, it's unique to them, and it creates a connection between their learning and their degree. Now, assessing that is not easy, and that's a whole other conversation for a CPL session probably. But just know if you can do that, it's great. There are also places that will help you with that. CALE is one of them, the Council on Adult Experiential Learning. That's an area that can do that. But just ponder CPL and CPL usage. And again, it's not for everyone. You may have your own institutional rules on why you don't want to do that. But make sure that they are because of the learning outcome of the degree, not because they've just always been this way. Transfer credit deadlines are another area that don't always help adult learners in certain cases, especially if they're having trouble getting documentation in. A lot of times we'll usually have told our students, your term starts X, Y, and Z. You have to get all your documentation in by Y date. If you don't, everything's locked down and you can never transfer anything in again. And I know that may sound, some schools on this line may be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe people do that. There are some schools that will say nothing ever again, because it means I have to repackage your Title IV awarding. Because when you transfer in more credits after the student starts, you have to do a re-award and a recalc. And so they have very real reasons to do those deadlines, because they don't want to have to do a repackage and things like that. Institutional choice, you can do it. But when you have adult learners who maybe have some issues getting documentation, it may be something to consider differently if you have those hard deadlines. So just again, another thing to ponder when you're supporting adult learners. And the last is how they apply in some student support practices. And this is something that is I bring up because when we serve our adult students at University of Phoenix, one of the things we do is when we can, and it's permissible and schools will allow us, we'll order transcripts on behalf of our students. And we'll take that burden on that payment for it. So whatever fee you have, 7, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, whatever dollars you have, we will take the burden on that. So on part of their application, we ask what prior schools you went to, and we'll try to order the transcript. Now, some schools still require the student to order that transcript. In those cases, we can't. But when we can, we do. And that takes friction away from, again, that time-starved adult learner. It's not just a service we provide. We also know that if they have to spend time on the phone trying to trace down some things, they're less likely to have kind of it becomes a friction point in the process, and you want to remove friction from them because they may have kids, they may have taking care of adults, they may have whatever's going on in their life, and not the ability to chase those things down sometimes. So we want to make that as easy as possible. It's not for every school. We find that with adult learners, especially as an institution like mine that really is a focus on adult learners, it really helps. But so that's a choice for institutions to make, or to give that extra service out to them. And while it does create a cost for us, the benefit upside of them retaining because they have transfer credit outweighs that. So it's de minimis on our end. We had to do a lot of, and I've done it a lot of times, the financial analysis of why in my past, why it's viable. And once you get the retention curves of students who transfer credits, it usually pays for itself tons of times. So I'll stop there for a second. I see Josie has a comment. I'm going to read that and see if Wendy has anything to add on this one.
Well, and I'll just throw that in there, I haven't spent my entire career at University of Tennessee, so I've been at other institutions that did function differently. So especially the prior learning, my previous institution had global campuses and things like that. And so the adult learner population was a lot larger, and the prior learning credit was huge, especially creating the portfolios. And creating the portfolio didn't mean you just, had a person review it, they went through it, and then the student was assigned credit. After that, it was, these are the ones that we think you can use. But then there was a cost, but the cost per credit was usually much, much less than the cost of tuition, having to retake those courses or retake courses if you couldn't apply the prior learning credit. So it was a huge benefit, and it did create the connection with the adult learners, and they wanted to complete there. And the other thing I just wanted to mention in terms of especially the transfer credit deadlines and things like that, we reviewed transcripts going back to, I think the earliest I've seen thus far has been 79. Is if you have a historical database where you previously evaluated.
Oh, Wendy, you just went on mute suddenly. I don't know why, but your mute came on.
I don't know, I lost it. I don't know where I was.
You were talking about a database. If your earliest transcript you evaluated was 1979, and having a database of decisions, and that's right where you cut off.
Oh, okay. And that's what I was saying. Sometimes the timeline or the deadline is not necessary if you have that historical database, and you can research what those previous courses came in over, and students can still use those courses. So thought I'd just throw that in there. And I know I saw Josie's comment, so.
Yeah, Josie, and I do think there's a balance on like having deadlines versus the person who 52 years later wants you to keep evaluating things. I think there's a balance to that for sure, because you definitely don't want process churn, but you also want to give a little bit of give to the people that may be having trouble checking it down. That seems like an extreme example, so I apologize that one ever happened to you. Even though it wasn't me, I don't know why I'm apologizing, but I will on behalf of that happening. So yes, there's always exceptions. So with that, we are at our portion where we're at our open Q&A. So if there are any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand in our virtual Zoom land and I can call on you, I'd be glad to do that. But we're open to take any questions and see what you have on your mind about this topic. Josie, your hand's up. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was having trouble with the mute button. I'm kind of interested in trying to come up with a list of exceptions that would be allowable for limitations, because I have had, very old evaluations brought to me where it's like, I have no idea why this was done this way. You're asking me to call somebody up from retirement and find out what happened. But I'm interested if anyone has ever come up with a list of exceptions, or if they have a rule where they say, generally you need to appeal this within this time frame, but these are the exceptions we'll make allowances for. I'm just interested if anyone has a list of those.
So I'm going to turn it over to anyone in the audience who wants to answer before I would provide any feedback, just in case someone wants to help Josie as part of the community of practice call. Okay, without anyone coming off mute, I will go ahead and do that. Some exceptions, I kind of talked about some credit recency exceptions on that. But I will say that some of the exceptions are when you look at CPL, allowing major level coursework be satisfied at the lower division with CPL is an easy entryway on some of exceptions to be made on that end, because they are generally more generalist in nature. So for example, if someone has been working in an accounting office for 10 years and you don't want them to take their Intro to Accounting Principles course, using that, again, use an evaluation to make sure they have the learning to understand that, but doing that as an exception of some sort is something that's pretty well out there. I will say graduate PLA and upper division course PLAs is something that exists and you should use if you know how to do it and have the right kind of evaluators. Other things, I think the way I look at exceptions always is, where is the discipline and what are you trying to satisfy? And in certain cases, like if you have a science related discipline, for example, nursing, engineering in certain cases, or some other science, the level of openness you have to make exceptions is less. Whereas if you have a generalist degree or a more broad topic degree, the openness to make exceptions is broader at that point in time from that and from a content perspective. From a documentation perspective, I don't know if anyone has a list on that. We could probably, and that's something Wendy and Mike and Belma for us to think about, if AACRAO would make a transfer exception. Like these are kind of things you can do and are okay in these weird scenarios. So that might be a good way to do it. So Josie, those are my brief thoughts on it. I don't know if that helps at all, but that's it. Or if you have a specific thing you want me to source my mind for on an exception that you don't know what to do or not, I'll be glad to answer that as well. So I got a thumbs up from Josie. Look at Zoom. Zoom, I don't know if anyone else knows this. Sorry, my segue. In the last couple of weeks, they've added in more emoji and other functions, and I thank them for that. So thank you, Zoom, for that, because it was kind of frustrating. Zoom was kind of a little bland. Anyways, other questions from the audience on anything they're thinking of? So Julie sent me a message, I just see it in the chat, of I've heard non-traditional or adult learners used throughout. I thought the latest research was getting away from those terms and been hearing post-traditional. Do you have any sense on the current best language? So, it's an interesting question, Julie. Part of my nomenclature, unfortunately, is painted by my experience. And so those are words I use a lot. You are correct. There is a growing trend of using different terminology outside of adult or non-traditional learners. So that is something. I don't think, just like in PLA, and I'll use the corollary of PLA. PLA was used for a very, very long time, and just recently ACE and KL came out and said you should be using the term credit for prior learning. I know it's different in regards to some describing a student versus describing a thing, but in a sense, having to learn that is a process. So for those, if you hear CPL, it's prior learning, but that's the new kind of thing. With post-traditional, there hasn't been kind of a unified statement on that yet, although the information and the literature is starting to say we should probably look at this differently because it is such a big segment and those type of things. I wouldn't be surprised, Julie, in some case, if it is ultimately something else after post-traditional too. So it could be post-traditional for right now as people settle in and a bunch of different think tanks come together. They may figure out a different terminology, and that's what we settle with. But apologies to all those. You're correct. Adult learners, because some of them are on adult, they're and some of them are not non-traditional. It just becomes the learners. And for certain cases, I have heard that is the learners, the 25-year-old plus. That is who needs the market. So I've heard that thrown around. I think Lumino started that, but anyway, I digress. So great question, Julie. Really appreciate that one. Josie has her hand up for another one.
Yeah, sorry, I always do. What are some good examples you would say of data that universities can track and collect to help evaluate their effectiveness with adult learners and supporting them?
So first of all, that assumes also you have the appropriate data warehouses to know what your adult learners are and the data in the system. So, from an age standpoint, because you have to be able to know their admissions date versus their age at the admissions date and some of those other things. So there are some SISs that are really terrible. Let's just put it that way. So I make the assumption with the answer that I give you that you can identify who your adult learners are or your post-traditional, as it were, on this. In that case, to track the effectiveness, the first thing is you want to start creating retention curves of the group that are your, I'll call them more traditional versus your post-traditional learners. And retention curves, excuse me, can range from two things. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice for a second. 1 second, Josie. Sorry about that. So one curve is actually, if you're a term-based institution, how many terms that they stay in compared to others. Because what some people look at as the normal success metric is, I'll call it credit earning pace, which is how many credits you consume during a term. With adult learners, especially if you have a very traditional academic design, they may not be able to take 12 semester credits in a term. They may only be able to take 9. And as long as they move on to the next term and move towards completion, that's still success for them. It may not be success what you would normally look at, because you want, and again, I'm talking semester credits on the Title IV full-time loads. You may want 12 or 15 credits that term. They may not be able to do that for whatever reason. And that's why a lot of schools that serve actually adult learners have different academic calendars for them, because they can consume content differently. But in a traditional basis, you do want to keep a monitor on credit earning pace, but you want to keep a monitor on trajectory and trajectory to completion. And if they're staying in the game term over term over term, which may include looking at where a lot of your traditional students drop off in the summer, for whatever case, they may take a summer course to keep it in the game. And so you want to look at those retention curves for the populations, because what you may find over time, the completion rates of these students bypass their credit consumption may look like this, but their completion rates bypass it that way. And that's the best way to start doing it on basic metrics. There are other things in regards to, depending on if you have a learning management system and your faculty are all forcing people to use it, engagement data in the classroom, there are other learning ways. And so since I'm on the learning side of the house in my institution now from my prior job, we look at it as engagement and learning and engagement and outcomes and assessment data. And what you may find is in assessment data, especially in the major course of study, some adult learners may actually do better in assessment outcomes because they have prior knowledge they're bringing to the table in a subject matter. So those are all different metrics to look at, as long as you can get to the hub of where your line of demarcation is on your traditional versus, again, post-traditional learners are. But I definitely strongly suggest, if you just look at credits earned in one given period of time, you may be seeing the wrong thing, because they have different needs and different outcomes on that. It's about the end goal. Once you get them in, do they reach the end goal at a better clip and better pace on that? Open to anyone else on the call that has supported adult learners this way and other metrics, but that's the simple metric on that end from that. And it's ultimately the end of completion and some overall course consumption, but that has to be longitudinal looking back, which sometimes some administrators, to be real blunt, don't want to have the patience for. But that's me putting my administrator hat on, saying we have to do a better job. But I'll take it off now and come back to transfer credit. Oh, Wendy, I see the plug. Yeah. I have a feeling I may show up there. So anything else from anyone on the call? All right. Well, all of you have been a wonderful audience. I'm so glad you're able to join us today. Our next topic, to give you a plug for that, is actually going to be international transfer credit. We're hoping to get a guest speaker from one of the international evaluation agencies. So be on the lookout for that. Should be a fun session on that end, and it will be recorded again for those that are interested in. And then you also have my email address and Wendy's email address. Feel free to reach out. And the last thing, if any of you are interested, this is the time of the year where we look for new committee members, and the Transfer and Articulation Committee has room for more members. So if anyone is interested in joining the Transfer and Articulation Committee for AACRAO, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll give you the process and way to do that. And we'd love to have you on board as we grow this important topic. So I think that's it. Velma or Mike, anything else for the good of the order?
I think we should be good. We'll have the recording up soon. So
Perfect.
wishing everybody a wonderful weekend.
Thanks all. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.